there's no group of folks who are happier in America today than married moms and married dads. And so I'm just trying to kind of communicate that message to everyone, but also to younger adults in particular, to kind of get them to realize and appreciate that they should focus more on preparing for marriage, finding someone who'd be worthy of marriage, and then going ahead once they found that person and getting married.
We're thrilled to have Brad Wilcox with us, and this is all talking about what makes you happy, what provides joy for you. You know, American happiness has hit an all-time low, and some people think, oh, it's the economy or, failing schools. And Brad says, I think there's something else going on. He's written the book, Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. I like that. That's Brad is.
I feel like I need a dun 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 dun.
No kidding. Brad Wilcox is a professor of sociology and the director of National Marriage Project and senior fellow of the Institute for Family Studies. Welcome to the show.
Ken, it's great to be here today.
Well, it's good to have you. And so we're going to be talking about marriage and whether people should be married or single. How did you become interested in this particular topic? Where's this come from?
Yeah, King, I was interested kind of in this because I was raised by a single mom and kind of in college had the sense, I think unusually so for a college student, that marriage, fatherhood were important for, especially I think boys. But as I kind of have been studying this issue in recent years, I've been kind of talking to a lot of female undergraduates here at the University of Virginia, and there's just kind of a palpable sense of difficulty that they're experiencing in finding guys who are worthy of commitment and might be good to get married down the road. And so I've just been understanding, I think, how as we kind of go forward, kind of marriage is going to become more challenging, not just for our kids in the country, but for adults as well.
Yeah, nobody wants to get married these days.
Yeah, it's a big problem.
Yeah. So what's the dealio?
So I think this is this weird situation where, and part of the challenge is that a lot of people think that marriage is either a not great or even a bad deal, particularly for women. And what they don't realize is when you actually look at the data, what you find is that the happiest Americans today, both for men and for women, are married men, married women, especially married dads and married moms. Now, I'm a father, I've got a bunch of kids at home. I understand and appreciate how much suffering and sacrifice and any sort of chaos follows from having children, but there's kind of this incredible sense of meaning too that also flows from having kids. Whether it's watching your kids play basketball or talk about interesting historical fact in their homework, whatever it might be. And so again, what we're seeing is that for both men and women, there's no group of folks who are happier in America today than married moms and married dads. And so I'm just trying to kind of communicate that message to everyone, but also to younger adults in particular, to kind of get them to realize and appreciate that they should focus more on preparing for marriage, finding someone who'd be worthy of marriage, and then going ahead once they found that person and getting married.
Married people are happier. Mm-hmm. That's good to know. Oh. Yeah.
It's good for all three of us, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So in particular, we see in the research is that married folks are about 150% happier than their fellow Americans who are not married. And then when it comes to kind of like the number one predictor of happiness is the quality of your marriage. So it far surpasses how much money you have, the degree on your wall, the kind of job you do, whether or not you're religious, how much sex you have, how healthy you are. All these factors in our models, they're predictive of happiness, but they don't compare to basically reporting that you have, a good marriage. So I think it's just worth thinking about, at this time of year, as we kind of approach Valentine's Day, what are some things that I can do practically to strengthen my marriage, or if I'm dating, to strengthen my dating relationship.
You were talking about how married people are happier, and that happiness transcends other things. Some of the stuff that we're told will make us happy, like a lot of money in the bank account, we got a great career. But you mentioned we, on average, just overall, people are less happy. We have a lot of deaths from, let's say, mental health issues. We have so many of us thinking like American dream is so out of our reach now. So what exactly does marriage have to do with all of that?
Yeah, so I have a new report coming out from a colleague at Brookings indicating that the number one predictor of deaths of despair, and so for your audience, that means deaths related to things like suicide, alcohol poisoning, or some kind of drug overdose. These are called deaths of despair in America, and they've been, unfortunately, in recent years, reaching record heights. That's kind of like the negative part of the story, and when it comes to mental health. When it comes to kind of the financial story, we find that some places in America are much more likely to promote the American dream, the rags to riches story, where you kind of grow up poor and then become, affluent, rich as an adult. And some parts of our country are much more likely to keep you trapped in poverty. And the number one predictor there of, basically being in a region that either promotes the American dream or prevents the American dream financially from taking hold is the share of two-parent families in a given community, which of course is really about marriage as well. So we're just kind of seeing, Misty, on a number of different fronts that the strength of marriage, the strength of our families ends up being hugely important to a lot of the biggest issues now facing our country.
Wow. Well, that kind of leads to my question about what's the good news about marriage, and what is it especially in regard to this happiness that we're talking about and the welfare of our kids?
Yeah, so the good news is that most actually marriages in America are going to go the distance today. I think back in the 70s and 80s, we all kind of had that statistic in our head that 1 in 2 marriages would end in divorce, and that was true back then. But the divorce rate has come down since then. So most marriages today will go the distance, which is, I think, pretty good news.
That's good news. Yeah.
Yeah, no. And for our
like
kids,
that.
we're seeing actually the share of kids who are being raised in stably married parents is sort of ticking up since 2012, partly because divorce is down in America. So at least for those folks who are getting married today and are having kids in marriage today, we're seeing kind of some better trends playing out. And then I also talk in the book about how there are 4 groups in particular that I call the masters of marriage. And these 4 groups are especially likely today to both be married and to either A, be happily married, or B, be stably married. And those 4 groups are Asian Americans, religious Americans, college educated Americans, and conservative Americans. In different ways, they've kind of figured out some of the values and virtues, not to mention financial resources, that make getting married, staying married, and being happily married easier for Americans today.
So what is it about those groups that causes them to stay married?
So it's both a kind of a cultural story and a cash story. On the cash, what we see is that having a steady stream of income and having shared assets, for most Americans, that would be a home that they own together. These 2 kind of things are helpful financially for them. And then we also see on the financial front, this is kind of, I think, surprising to some people, is that it's particularly the case that kind of his stable employment that predicts a couple getting married in the first place today and then staying married in the second place. So there's a study out of Harvard, and it shows that when the wife loses her job, for instance, no effect on divorce. But when he loses his job, the husband, they see a 33% increase in divorce. So there's just something about kind of having the husband, be gainfully employed that's still important, in the 21st century. Whereas whether she works, outside the home, less important here. So that's sort of the cash story. When it comes to culture, we see that things like communion, commitment, and community are super important. So when it comes to communion, for instance, regular date nights are a big predictor of successful marriages. Just to kind of give you one indicator there, what we see is that couples who have regular date nights at least once a month, although preferably more than that, getting out, doing something fun as a couple, have sex more than once a week. Whereas couples who don't make that effort for whatever reason or are unable to do that have sex less than once a week. And that's kind of a pretty big indicator of a healthy marriage. When it comes to commitment, couples who kind of prioritize sexual fidelity and who also kind of don't put divorce into their thinking or their conversations when they're going through difficult and challenging times are more likely to be flourishing. And then on the community piece, we see that couples who kind of share friends, who have strong marriages, who are kind of living family-focused lives, are themselves also more likely to be flourishing because birds of a feather flock together. So you are your friends in a sense is kind of the story here. So pick your friends, wisely. And then in particular, when it comes to kind of that community piece, what we see is that couples who are engaged in their local religious communities, could be a church, temple, synagogue, whatever, are more likely to be flourishing, about 15 percentage points more likely to be happily married, and between 30 and 50% less likely to be getting divorced. So for all those reasons, we're seeing that, better educated, more religious, more conservative, and Asian American couples today are more likely to be succeeding when it comes to the state of their unions.
Let's drill into that a little bit. Is that something that's built into their culture?
Yeah, so I think, if you've been following kind of marriage debates in America in recent years, you'll know there's been a lot of discussion of kind of the class divide. And that is, again, that more educated, more affluent Americans are more likely to get married and stay married. So there's, a financial story that we've just, touched on. But what a lot of Americans, including kind of journalists who kind of cover this issue, don't really appreciate is also a cultural story. And again, Asian Americans and religious Americans and conservative Americans tend to be more likely to embrace certain kinds of values, certain kinds of virtues that stabilize their marriages, prioritize marriage, and kind of make it more likely that they succeed. So I talked, for instance, to a Korean American woman in Virginia, and she was saying that she's got some teenagers, and while romance is important for her and her husband, it's not the number one priority. And they really see kind of their marriage as crucial to their kids' success. And so, that's one reason why she and her husband are so committed to one another and to their family and their kids. And so, kind of the emotional temperature, the sort of the sparks flying is going to ebb and flow in any marriage. But from her perspective, that's fine, because she realized that her kids are going to be more likely to be flourishing if, mom and dad have a strong and stable marriage. And that kind of sentiment is certainly, I think, often pretty typical among, the Asian American parents and couples that I spoke with. What we see, for instance, is the most stable couples in America are hailing from from India. They're immigrants from India. So it just kind of gives you a sense of, and when I talk to Indian parents, often they're talking about how much they realize that their kids are more likely to make it in America, both educationally and then future professional success as well, if they have the benefit of stably married parents in the background. So it's kind of one example of how that cultural piece is kind of working out, in this case, for Asian Americans.
So yeah, let's talk about the elites.
So when it comes to kind of elites, what we're seeing is that there are a lot of messages out there today that are kind of discounting the value of marriage. So when I was actually finishing up this book, I saw a headline trending on Twitter from Bloomberg, the financial news service, obviously, and it said that women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer. It suggested to us that marriage was kind of a path to immiseration for women, not to prosperity. We're also kind of getting messages, surprisingly now, too, from the online right. I'm thinking of Pearl Davis and Andrew Tate, big online influencers, that are suggesting that marriage is a bad deal for men, whereas the kind of older message from the mainstream left was that marriage is kind of a bad deal for women, as that Bloomberg article suggested. And even more recently, we've been getting like tons of articles making, in a sense, the case for polyamory. Big New York Times spread titled this, How a Polyamorous Mom Had a Big Sexual Adventure and Found Herself. And, very complimentary portrait in the New York Times of Molly Roden-Winter, who has got a new memoir called More, making, again, the case for polyamory. And all of these pieces are kind of basically, in some ways, discounting either marriage itself, either financially or emotionally, as as a pathway for Americans, or they're kind of discounting some of the key virtues that would sustain a good marriage today, like the virtue of fidelity in a monogamous relationship. And these are examples of, again, where our elites, I think, are giving us bad messages that are counterproductive, because we know that in general, married men and women are happier and they're a lot more prosperous than their never married single peers. So for instance, when it comes to women's financial health, women who are married have about 10 times the assets in their 50s, getting close to retirement, compared to their never married female single peers. So not exactly the story that Bloomberg was kind of giving us in that headline. And they were actually basing their assertions on one study from the feds of single people, and somehow we're kind of using that to generate this false headline about marriage and women. So the point here simply is that our elites are often giving us what I would call anti-nuptial messages that don't help us, acquire the virtues that would sustain a good marriage, and that kind of undercut our interest and our aspirations regarding marriage as well.
The pandemic, changed so much about everything about our daily lives and our perspectives. No doubt that affected how we think of love and marriage and the choices that we make for our family. How would you say that COVID influenced marriage, especially like when it comes to young adults, how they date and marry?
Yeah, so in terms of kind of the immediate aftermath of COVID was obviously less marriage and actually less divorce as well. And couples who were already married kind of expressing, net, like actually more commitment. So what we see oftentimes is in times of trial and tribulation, folks are in a relationship. Some see their relationships break up, but sort of the average response is greater commitment, in the face of some big, adversity. So that's sort of like the good news. But I think the bad news, Misty, here is that for a lot of younger adults, the pandemic just kind of accelerated the move to sort of being online, spending too much time in the virtual world and not spending enough time in the real world with real people. And so what we've been seeing is, dating has been falling in recent years because of smartphones in large part, and social media in large part, and also gaming for guys as well. And just socializing more generally. And obviously socializing and dating are key avenues into getting married and having a serious relationship of one stripe or another. And so, I'm concerned that we're seeing what I call like the closing of the American heart unfold in this country with, drops in dating, drops in marriage, drops in childbearing. And so in the book, I project that 1 in 3 young adults today in their 20s will never marry. Again, 1 in 3 will never marry. And we've never, Misty, been at a point where there's so many young adults who are going to be facing a lifetime ahead of them without the benefit of a spouse, and then often without the benefit of any children as well. And so we're going to see a lot more kinless Americans heading into midlife, and especially later life, in ways that are going to put them at a more precarious position, both financially, but also socially and emotionally too. So that's what's, I talked about some good news earlier on, and that is that the folks who are getting married today are their odds of succeeding are higher. But we're just going to see a lot more young adults today never marrying, and that's sort of the thing I'm most concerned about as we go forward in this country.
It's interesting, guys. If you turn back time in history, and it's more of an issue for women than men, you'd be an old maid if you weren't married by whatever age it is. Fill it in there.
Yeah.
Where now today it's like no one's getting married. They're just not going to do it.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating how we've gone from one extreme. I don't think you should be forced to get married because everybody's married, because that's the way it used to be in the old, in older times. But now we're just not getting married.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not everyone is supposed to get married or should get married or can get married. And I certainly acknowledge that. But we're kind of going from a pattern where between 80 and 90% of Americans would be getting married, and we're heading towards a pattern where 60-something% of Americans are going to get married. So it's just going to be a lot of folks who are finding themselves unwillingly single and also unwillingly childless, in their 50s and beyond. I think that's a pretty. We've already kind of seen this story unfortunately play out in places like Japan. And so this sort of East Asian pattern is in a sense jumping the Pacific and is now coming to our shores. It's not going to be as bad as it is in Japan. I mean, Japan lost more than 500,000 people in terms of population last year. But
wow.
Some of the dynamics we've seen in Japan, where lots of older people are kind of living and dying on their own, where they've got companies that are specializing in, unfortunately, tell you this story, but they're specializing in cleaning out remains of people who've been deceased for weeks because no one's been by to visit them, discover them. So this is kind of what happens when so many people end up having no spouse and no children as they move through their adult lives.
Every Hallmark movie I've ever watched, with maybe there's been 1 or 2 or more, tell me that I need to find my soulmate. Is that the key to a healthy, happy marriage?
Yeah, great question, Sally Marie. And I certainly don't want to discount the importance of romance, but I want to just have people understand and appreciate that once you get married, there's hormonal shifts, there are social shifts. And so that kind of like magical feeling that you experience, like where there are butterflies in your stomach, in that first phase of a romantic relationship, well, the butterflies, Sally Marie, they tend to fly away for most of us.
Ooh.
And they can come back, right? And that's why date nights are so important. This is also National Marriage Week, coming up from February 7th to 14th. And we're encouraged in National Marriage Week to kind of make a priority of having regular date nights. But it's also important to realize that marriage is about much more than just that emotional connection. It's about financial security. It's about being there for any children that you have. And it's also kind of about, I would say, kind of recognizing that love is not a feeling, really. It's about a commitment to will the good of the other, to kind of put the welfare of your kids, your wife, your husband, any kin you might have, above your own welfare. And so what we see is that not only the couples who kind of have this more family first model of marriage rather than a soulmate model are more likely to be, not surprisingly, stably married, because making feelings like the governor of your marriage is often going to lead you down to divorce court. But they're also actually happier in their marriages too, because they recognize, they appreciate, they realize that marriage is about more than just feelings. It's about, again, enjoying a secure financial future. It's about having kids who grow up reasonably well adjusted. It's about having, parents and in-laws who are more secure because they know that their kids and their kids' spouse, are stable, and that holidays and vacations and all those things are going to be a lot easier because people are keeping their marriages together. So what I'm saying then is that people, yes, they should try to keep the romance alive in their marriage, but not sort of see their marriage only through the prism of like this idea there's the perfect partner out there for me, we're going to have this perfect fit, it's going to be relatively frictionless, and this one person's going to make me so happy, so fulfilled, all or most of the time. So that's sort of the soulmate myth, and I think a more realistic understanding of the fact that we're all flawed people, and being married can be really tough at times, but nevertheless, over a lifetime, it tends to be great for most of us, and for our kids, and for our kin more generally.
Yeah, misunderstanding that soulmate thing. I think what takes, the phrase is the honeymoon is over. How long does that take before you realize?
Yeah.
This isn't always easy. And, there's some work involved. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I love that whole concept that you mentioned of commitment, because we like to think that flame is going to burn red hot forever. Yep. But there's the reality of life and bills. And I remember when we got married, our pastor was so wise and said, this is going to be fun for a while, but pretty soon you're going to settle down to figure out the checkbook and how you're going to get along. And so my husband and I have always talked about the matter of commitment is what bridges the gap. And it's so vital and so important. So I appreciate that you said that.
Yeah, and it's kind of, I think one way to think about this is just to sort of recognize that story of Odysseus, and in the sort of Greek mythology, he's, going by the sirens, in the Mediterranean, and he has his, shipmates tie him to the mast so that he's not attracted to those sirens and not sort of thrown off course and wrecking his boat and his life. And of course, in the story, he's heading back to his family. So there's a way in which kind of recognizing too that, that romance ebbs and flows in a marriage, and people are also going to be often, I think, surrounded by folks who might be attractive alternatives. And so if you have that commitment, like you're talking about, Sally Marie, you're going to be able to navigate, those alternatives more successfully than folks who might be kind of in a rough spot in their marriage and are tempted to kind of look elsewhere at that moment in time. So this is why, in part, kind of realizing that commitment is so central to a marriage helps you kind of get through those moments when it's not feeling like a soulmate. It's feeling like, like that difficult person in your life who happens to be your wife or your husband.
Brad, you talked about how married men and women actually, I guess, buck the thought that you're going to make more money as being single, and you're saying the opposite is true. Have you drilled down as to why people that are married have greater incomes or greater net wealth?
So it's important to kind of be clear here. So there is what's called basically a motherhood penalty. And this is true for both married and single women too. So I think people often lose out on that fact. So if you have kids and you're a woman, you tend to work less and you make less. But in terms of like the household income, there's just no question that married Americans have more money and relatively more money today compared to the year that I was born in 1970. And so it's important to realize that there's, you've got often two earners. And then the other piece here though is that people who are married are more prudential often about their spending than people who are not married. They tend to save more, even at sort of like the same income level compared to like a cohabiting couple, for instance, or compared to two single people. And they accumulate more assets often in the form of like a 401k or a shared home together. So again, as they hit their 50s, both women and men are in a much better position financially than their single, never married peers. Actually, one more thing I would mention there too is that family instability, relationship instability is super expensive. I was talking to one man in the Southeast, and he had, I think, 3 kids with 3 different women, and he'd married recently another woman, and a substantial share of his paycheck every month went to child support. And if he had just gotten married to one person and stayed married to her and had his kids with that one person, he'd be in a much better spot financially than he is today. So again, just sort of getting married, staying married tends to reap a lot of financial benefits for men and women in America today.
Divorce is expensive. It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah, big expense. Yep.
It's funny, my wife's mom and dad always joked, regarding divorce. Of course, whoever leaves has to take the kids. That was another reason to stay together.
Goodness.
Wow.
You have a chapter, the Maybe I Do mentality, and you write about this other influence on, you call it good fences make for good marriages. So let's talk about the good I can say it, good fences.
Yeah. So again, I think what's striking, Misty, about our current culture today is that there are a lot of people who are kind of discounting the importance of fidelity and even now monogamy as we've been seeing. And yet when I talk to ordinary couples across the U.S., what I found was that couples who kind of embraced that fidelity norm, like who were intentional about it, were much more likely to be flourishing. And so I talked to a guy who I call Patrick here in Virginia, who's successful, good-looking redhead, plays in a band, on once a month on the weekends, travels a lot for work. I mean, he's the kind of guy, if we're just being honest here, I think could easily kind of get into trouble when it comes to, infidelity. But he's very intentional about when he's traveling, kind of mentioning that he's married. And he said, I'm a family man, and he will talk about his wife and kids regularly when he's on the road. So that's sort of one way he signals that he is kind of committed to his wife. And then he says online, which I think where a lot of people can get in trouble today too, is he says, quote, my wife is tagged in a majority of my posts. My status is listed as married, and interactions online are treated the same way as if in person. I do not follow old girlfriends, as there is a reason they're in that category. Okay, so he's both in person and virtually kind of keeping up a little bit of a fence to protect his marriage. And I think it's kind of no accident that his wife gave him a 10 on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of the quality of their marriage. And then we kind of just see, with the research more generally, that Americans who believe that, quote, infidelity is always wrong are about 13 percentage points more likely to be very happy in their marriages compared to Americans who say it's not always wrong. And unfortunately, in recent years, we've been seeing a slight uptick in the share of Americans who would kind of take that less, stringent approach to fidelity in the general social survey.
So one of the things that I was wondering is, when it comes to churchgoers, you say that people that are in church make more money, and they're also more committed because they've gone to church. What is it that going to church changes things as far as being committed in your marriage?
Well, it's interesting. Again, I think the media is often giving us a negative portrait of the sort of faith and family connection. There was a New Yorker story, for instance, that kind of talked about how, evangelical Christian men were kind of hung up with, kind kind of puritanical on that issue, and it was leading towards, guilt and marital unhappiness and divorce and all this. Just a hugely negative portrait the New Yorker was painting of the sort of link between Christian faith and marital quality for this particular subculture. I'm Catholic. But what was sort of lost in this New Yorker story was that, look at the big picture, the average picture. What you see is that Americans who attend church are about 15 percentage points more likely to say that they're very happy in their marriages. That's including evangelicals together, compared to couples who don't attend together. They're about 30 to 50% less likely to end up in divorce court. This is a big difference, statistically speaking. So again, we know, I'm religious. I have friends in my church, my local Catholic church, who I know have struggled in their marriages at one point or another. I've certainly struggled at different points in my marriage, but on average, what we're seeing is that religion tends to be a source of strength for couples, not an obstacle to having a strong and stable marriage.
When it comes to marriage, I know this is something that I actually had a problem with when my husband and I first got married, because I'd been so independent for so long. And it was very hard to take that we before me approach.
Right.
But that's very important, obviously to the relationship. Just you're happier, living habits are a little better. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so also we've been getting a lot of messages from, elites about the importance of kind of taking a me-first approach to marriage. One example of this, right, is just money. And so I talk in the book about how, there are stories in The Atlantic, there are finance gurus like Susie Norman who are kind of telling people, keep separate accounts. And yet when I talk to ordinary couples, they talked about the ways in which kind of having shared accounts were linked to better outcomes. They had the sense that, like, if there was a big expense, they could just work together to address it. There wasn't kind of like his and hers money that was sort of a source of division for them. And then more concretely, what I found is that couples who have shared accounts are about 13 percentage points more likely to be very happy in their marriages, and they're about 20% less likely to end up in divorce court. And what's fascinating here, Misty, is that there's even an experimental study that's just come out from Indiana University, and they randomly assigned newlyweds to joint accounts and separate accounts. And they found that, everyone saw a bit of a decline in their marital quality in those first 2 years of marriage, but the decline was much more precipitous for the couples who are randomly assigned to separate accounts. By contrast, the couples who are randomly assigned to shared accounts were doing a lot better across those first 2 years of marriage. So it's a pretty kind of rigorous piece of evidence in favor of this idea that we before me approaches to money and other things are good for our marriages today.
Wow. That's amazing. Mm-hmm. Just, I don't know
it's probably a better approach to life in general, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So shared last name, same story. And again, we can, I'm just sort of saying, people are going to raise hackles about that, but I'm just sort of saying, it's like the more you have a we first, team first approach to marriage, in terms of your money, in terms of your family name, all these things bind us together. Shared assets is kind of in some ways the same story as well. The more you share in common, time, money, name as a couple, on average, and we know there are exceptions, but on average, the more likely you are to be flourishing as a couple.
Wow. Even sharing the same last name.
Yeah.
That's
linked
interesting.
to happier marriages, yeah.
Huh.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess it's more of the Bible says you become one flesh. So I think the more you make that a reality in every part of your life, it sounds like you're more committed. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, exactly. And the same thing is true, not only date nights, but also in terms of like the more time you spend if you have kids doing fun things, but also even chores. And to be frank, like Saturday morning is chores in our household. Toughest time of the week for me and for my wife with our kids, a lot of moaning and groaning.
Yes.
We have to just sort of grin and bear it, hopefully. But I was surprised to find out that couples who spent more time with their kids doing family chores together also happier in their marriages as well. So it's just, and again, I think it's about kind of like forging this, we first approach to marriage and family that's helpful.
I'm glad I'm not the only family that does Saturday morning chores. Seems like a lot of people are doing it on Saturday. This is good. Thank you. We're hanging out with Dr. Brad Wilcox. Get Married, Why Americans Must Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and save civilization. Not children, but we'll save children too. Brad, thanks so much for hanging with us today. This has been really interesting.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me on to your